Forbidden borders, Americans banned in 2025. Imagine this. It's the year 2025. You're standing at the airport with your bags packed and passport in hand, ready to travel abroad. But as you approach the counter, a stern officer informs you, Americans are no longer allowed to cross international borders. Your trip is canceled, not because of a personal error, but because of a geopolitical shift you never saw coming. This may sound like science fiction, but the political, environmental, and health crises brewing today could make this grim scenario a reality. So how did we get here? And what does this tell us about the world we're building? Let's unpack the escalating series of events that could lead to a future where Americans, once symbols of unrestricted travel, are barred from setting foot in foreign lands. Just a few decades ago, the thought of Americans being denied entry to other countries was inconceivable. The U.S. passport symbolized freedom, opening doors to nearly any country around the world. But global dynamics have shifted. What was once a gateway could become a wall, underscoring the consequences of years of political decisions, broken agreements, and neglectful policies. This video explores a terrifying possibility, a ban on American travel globally by 2025. It's not just fear-mongering, it's a wake-up call, pieced together through an interconnected web of rising geopolitical tensions, environmental collapse, uncontained health crises, and fractured diplomacy. The story isn't just about borders, it's about trust, or the lack of it, between nations, and the growing perception that the U.S. has failed its global responsibilities. Let's start with the seeds of distrust sown by political and economic conflicts. For decades, the United States exerted immense global influence. Its allies depended on its military and economic power to maintain international order. But cracks have been forming for years. What if those cracks grew into enormous fractures? As 2025 approached, trade wars with key nations escalated, shaking alliances to their cores. Sanctions, once used sparingly, became a trademark of American foreign policy. Countries began retaliating. A tit-for-tat dynamic developed, eroding global cooperation. For example, the weakening relationship between the U.S. and China reached a breaking point. From disputes over intellectual property to military standoffs in the South China Sea, tensions affected trade and travel. Eventually, an all-out blockade was declared, cutting all forms of exchange between the two nations, including tourism and education. China wasn't alone. Other nations aligned with this approach, citing political grievances and protectionism. The aftermath was devastating, not only for Americans looking to travel, but also for businesses, universities, and families reliant on international mobility. Trust, a critical currency in diplomacy, was depleted. How did people react? Both at home and abroad, protests erupted. The world watched, debating whether these geopolitical tensions were preventable or inevitable. As geopolitics faltered, another crisis added fuel to the fire: environmental collapse. It wasn't just an American problem, it was a global one. But America's handling of climate change became a sore point internationally. America, historically one of the largest carbon emitters, was accused of not pulling its weight in addressing the climate emergency. International accords were ignored. Activists criticized U.S. policies for prioritizing economic interests over environmental ones. And then things got worse. Catastrophic wildfires raged across California, spreading toxic air globally. Coastal cities, already struggling with rising sea levels, became unlivable. Hurricanes tore through the southern states with unprecedented fury. The ripple effects didn't stop at the border. The environmental devastation impacted neighboring regions. The tipping point came when thousands of climate migrants from destabilized areas attempted to seek refuge abroad, only to be met with hostility. Other countries began to close their borders, fearful of the strain these displaced communities might bring. In response, countries justified banning Americans, reasoning that U.S. policies contributed directly to the climate-induced chaos. Trust, already eroded by politics, was further destroyed by environmental neglect. Personal stories punctuated this shift. The words of one displaced individual summed it up: "I wanted a better life, but when I reached that border, I didn't just find a wall, I found a reminder of how broken the system is." The third and perhaps most horrifying chapter in this narrative came in the form of health crises. By 2025, the world had dealt with repeated pandemics, exposing weaknesses in global health cooperation. The United States, once a leader in public health, struggled to regain international trust after the mishandling of earlier pandemics. A biosecurity breach in U.S. research facilities sparked outrage. What should have been contained quickly spread with devastating consequences. Foreign nations responded swiftly, imposing strict travel bans on Americans. Initially temporary, these bans became permanent as confidence in America's biosecurity weakened. The U.S. was no longer seen as a safe participant on the global stage of health cooperation. A chilling fact emerged: other nations accelerated health research partnerships among themselves, excluding the U.S. entirely. For the first time in history, Americans were seen not as global partners, but as potential threats. Meanwhile, personal stories emerged of families torn apart by these restrictions. College students on exchange programs found themselves stranded indefinitely. Parents separated from their children overseas begged governments to reconsider, only to face bureaucratic coldness. These individual tragedies painted a stark picture of how broken diplomacy coupled with public health mismanagement could isolate even the most powerful nation on Earth. All these factors, geopolitics, climate, and health, culminated in one critical collapse: diplomacy. Diplomatic relationships are built on trust and interdependence, but by 2025, both had disintegrated for the United States. Key alliances like NATO were strained to the breaking point. Economic coalitions faltered. Multinational agreements withered as member nations chose regional solidarity over cooperating with the U.S. The result? A series of fractured treaties and weakened partnerships, isolating America further on the global stage. One turning point stands out: the rejection of a major global treaty. Following widespread failures to meet international expectations, the U.S. proposed its own terms to a climate agreement, attempting to rewrite rules in its favor. The global response was unanimous: rejection. The symbolic weight of this moment was undeniable. It marked the final straw, reinforcing America's isolation. Other nations responded by codifying travel bans, specifically targeting U.S. passport holders. America's isolation was no longer theoretical. It was a legal and diplomatic reality. Commentators called it a self-inflicted collapse. Millions of Americans now labeled as undesirables for travel were left grappling with a horrifying truth. Doors that were once open were now permanently closed. This is the reality we've explored today, a future where Americans are banned from crossing borders. Plausible or not, the idea isn't just a warning for the U.S. government. It's a wake-up call for every citizen. If we allow geopolitics to devolve into tit-for-tat rivalries, ignore the climate crisis, mismanage global health emergencies, and break down diplomacy, this imagined future could become our reality. But the power to change course lies in our hands. As individuals, we can advocate for policies that foster international cooperation. As communities, we can push for accountability, ensuring that we address environmental, health, and diplomatic concerns with urgency. And as a nation, we can rebuild trust with the global community through empathy and action. The door hasn't closed, not yet. It's up to us to ensure it stays open. Because if we don't act now, who's to say 2025 won't be the year travelers pack for journeys they'll never be allowed to take?